paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. My guest today is Cathy Kezelman. She is the executive director of the Blue Knot Foundation in Sydney, Australia. How are you doing today, Cathy?
Really good, thanks, Nick.
Could you tell us a little bit about the Blue Knot Foundation?
We're a national organisation that works to empower healing and recovery for people who've experienced repeated violence, abuse, neglect, and conservatively, that's 1 in 4 adults.
And you had your own journey to healing. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I did. So, by training, I'm a medico. And I was, working away in my practice. I'm also, married with, 4 children and a foster child. So, I used to appear to do everything with apparent ease, fiercely independent. And then my world fell apart. My niece, who I was very, very close to, died suddenly. And what that did was start an unraveling of my mind and took me back into, memories of childhood. When we say memories, they're not, I recall this happened. It was a real re-experiencing, reliving, being a young child, often in abject terror, experiencing all sorts of things that, for which I didn't have the words. And so I really uncovered what I believe is, something like 10 years of sexual abuse perpetrated by family members and others from religious institutions, as well as, what I experienced in the home, because my mother is a Holocaust survivor, and no one can judge, the trauma of the Holocaust. But what that meant for me was that she was unable to be there emotionally and to see what was going on and to respond. So as a child growing up with really no one to go to, no one to help me make sense of it, no one to help me feel safe, what I did, unbeknownst to me, was, really bury that away and dissociate it. And so when in my mid-40s, my niece died, all those memories and bits and fragments of memories and experience started to come back, and they, absolutely overwhelmed me and bombarded me. I spent a couple of years completely, almost bedbound. Obviously couldn't work, experiencing panic attacks and, a lot of anxiety, flashbacks, profound depression. I was very suicidal. And for a family, for my family, it was horrendous because, I'd been this apparently, very capable, available mother, although not as available as I would have liked to have thought, because of my dissociative capacity. But, my life completely was turned upside down. And then, I had to go on a journey of, trying to make sense of this. As a medical practitioner, I really had no idea what was happening. My training certainly hadn't prepared me, and I thought I was losing my mind because that's how it felt. And so, I had a very, very long process of therapy with a therapist who, walked alongside me, held the space for me. It took me forever to trust her because, I'd been so powerfully betrayed. Took me a long time to feel safe and to believe that someone could actually keep me in mind. And so, gradually, I tried to piece the pieces of those fragments that came back together to get some sort of narrative of what had happened to me. And I also did my own sort of investigations as well to try and, find concrete information that I could find. But what I know is that, some of the details of what I recall may have been changed, like all memory can be changed. But what I do know is that it helped me make sense of myself. And in retrospect, my lack of ability at that time to really emotionally engage, I was very defended, I was very protected. And, the journey that not only I've been on, but my whole family's been on, has been one of learning how to connect, how to really engage in a deep, meaningful way, to share our feelings and experiences and, abilities that, I really didn't have before.
A lot of people are diagnosed with DID in their 30s
Yeah.
and their 40s. I mean, that seems to be the norm.
Yeah.
And so you found a therapist that specialized. Did you have to see other type of psychiatric professionals before someone?
Yeah. So look, I found a therapist who could connect in a human way. She was a psychodynamic psychotherapist. I don't think she had particular expertise in dissociative disorders or DID, but what I know is that her humanity and her ability to engage and build a relationship of trust and safety, and to have excellent supervision, and probably to read. I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, obviously, but what I know is that she was able to engage with all the different parts of myself as they presented. And, over a long period of time, we're talking about a very long period of therapy, to help me, learn to manage, what were incredibly volatile emotions, to help me, to accept all parts of myself, even the ones that I was obviously carried enormous shame. And those are the parts which, in retrospect, I was trying to destroy with my suicidal ideation and gestures. So, yeah, I don't think it was about her being a specialist in DID. I think it was about her being an experienced relational therapist who took the time to understand what was going on and to, walk with me along the way. That was really, for me, it was about being heard, being accepted for the first time in my life, and just to have someone to hold the space where the, unspeakable could be spoken and thought about together. But what was, incredible during that journey, I mean, many things were incredible during that journey and terrifying at the same time, was the degree of dissociation that I experienced. And interestingly, my initial memories returned with my husband, just because obviously he was at the time the person that I trusted most. And needless to say, that was terrifying for him and for me. Neither of us knew what on earth was happening. But then obviously I sought some support. And what happened was that over time, as I built trust in my therapist, I would, dissociate almost as a response to knowing that a safe place was coming. So as I went for a session, I'd sit in the waiting room and, completely lose myself in the space. And by the time that I needed to go inside, I had lost a sense of my body, and often she'd have to lead me by the hand. But through that process of dissociation, which she didn't enable and which I didn't enable, the memories would come back. And, I'd experiencing all sorts of things in the room and she'd bear witness to them. And then, towards the end of the time, she'd work to ground me and bring me back into the space because, I was completely, in another space with a little bit of awareness of where I was, but very little. And that's where I learned the healing power of water. She'd give me a a drink of cold water, and often I couldn't even hold the cup, but just the effect of that water would start to bring me back into my body and then bring me back to a place where we could try and make sense of stuff that you can't make sense of, and so that I'd be safe to go home. And often, I'd either have to stay in her waiting room for a while until I was, or I'd walk just up to my car, often pass out in the car for a while until I was safe enough to drive and go home, try and re-enter my life, such as it was at the time.
How many years did it take you to put together a system that you felt functioned well with your family and society as a whole?
I mean, I don't think it's, you had a period of time and you've arrived, I think that's, an evolving space. I think it's still evolving. I think we all evolve all the time, regardless of whether we've, experienced this sort of trauma. But in terms of the therapy I was having when I was, profoundly impacted and non-functioning, probably up to 5 years. And towards the end of that time, I did try and write a lot. So, my mechanism for sorting things out is to write. And so that started off as a massive purge where I just, put all this stuff down. And I used to take it along to therapy, but, for a while, I couldn't even read it out. She'd have to read it. Because, I was still unable to really engage with it, even though I was pouring it out of myself. And that process of me writing, gradually I tried to weave those bits and fragments together into some sort of thing that made sense, some sort of story of my life. Because, if you don't know where you've come from, what happened to you along the way, how can you actually know who you are? And obviously I really struggled with who I was. And, one could look at me and say, well, you were a doctor and you're married. And, yes, I was, but I was very compartmentalised, very shut off. And that's what protected me. But in terms of being emotionally connected and engaged, I wasn't.
So you had a PhD in psychology?
No. I'm a medical.
Oh, a medical doctor. Okay.
Doctor.
When you went to a medical school, was there any? I mean, medical school there's a lot of pressure in medical school. Was there any indications?
No. I mean, I think that's how profoundly compartmentalized I was and shut off. I think, in fact, what medicine did for me is it gave me a self-definition when I didn't have one, when I really didn't have a sense of myself. I was a doctor, and so that was my definition, and I think it was very protective. And so there were no cracks at that time. The cracks. I've got a close friend who's very perceptive. And she reflects back to me that she had observed me dissociating over the years. And the cracks were starting to happen the moment my niece was killed suddenly. But prior to that, I'm sure I dissociated, right through my life, but I was certainly very unaware of it.
And what type of medicine did you practice?
I was a general practitioner.
General practitioner?
Yeah.
So you became a medical doctor, and you were successful as a medical doctor, and then your niece died, which seemed to be the critical mass for you to fragment. And then you worked through this for 5 years or so, and now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've worked through it for over 20 years, but when we're talking about the period of really not being able to function. During that time, I could barely get out of bed, just to get my kids to school and crawl back to bed was just overwhelming. From someone who's high functioning, to being like that, is very confronting and frightening, and obviously for my husband as well, enormously.
Actually, I'm still working on being a productive member of society. So
Aren't we all?
might have been, you're probably a few steps ahead of me. And then you decided to become the executive director of the Blue Knot Foundation, which helps not survivors of trauma. Could you
I don't know if I decided. I think it sort of chose me in a way. So, I mean, I was looking around for any information I could find while I was going through this process of therapy, because that's the way I make sense of things. So I read just about every psychology book in the library. I just explored all over the place. And I found in my exploration, I found an organisation called ASCA, which is the forerunner of Blue Knot Foundation, and put my toe in the water there. And I think because I had the title of doctor, I was soon asked to join the board of then ASCA. And so, it was really about me reaching out to look for help that I became involved in the organisation. And at that time, all of the people involved with the organisation and the board were people looking for help. So ASCA, now Blue Knot, has gone through, an enormous growth and development, really to put together what was a very good ethos from the start, which is, the voice of lived and living experience, but also with professional support, and to try and align those, which is what I believe we've done over time.
So your journey through DID, how has that helped you be the executive director of the Blue Knot Foundation? I mean, you obviously have insights into trauma that a lot of people, really intense insights into trauma that a lot of people wouldn't.
Yeah, look, obviously those sorts of experiences giveth and taketh away. But what it has done is given me an incredible passion to see survivors have the opportunity that I had, because in a way I was privileged. I wasn't privileged in my childhood or my experiences, but I was privileged in being able to find good help and help for the long haul, which for many, many people is unaffordable. And not to say that that's the only path to healing, but that was mine. And so my passion is also to invoke a level of understanding, because what I experienced, and what a lot of others experience, is that, when I fell off my perch, my medical colleagues ran a mile. And that's not about them as human beings. That's about human beings in general. I think, when we don't understand, we can be quite fearful. And I was no longer the doctor they knew. And so their definition of me was very challenged. And so it's that inherent lack of understanding, and together with that level of empathy and compassion, that, is part of what drives me. And we see this with, all sorts of life challenges. When people may lose a child or, have a tragedy, many people don't know what to say if they cross the road rather than having the conversation. And so, how do we, stop pretending that this is a rare event, but, understand that, this is a pervasive social practice that affects everyone, either directly or indirectly. And so start to break down them and us of, there's this group of people who are broken, and we have to fix them, rather than, we're a community and we all have different experiences along life's journey, which, impact us in various ways, which we respond to in various ways, depending on, the context of what's happened, the resources that we have as a result of other things that have happened. So how do we understand this and work together to have a more humane society that, provides the ground for people to have opportunities to heal and recover, or whatever words we want to use, to make sense of what happened to them as much as it can, but to live what we all want to live, which is, connected, meaningful, rich lives. So, that's where I'm coming from. And that's, where Blue Knot comes from.
I was looking at some of the statistics on your website, and I was these statistics are consistent with statistics in the United States and maybe Western countries. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before the age of 18. That's pretty much the Centers for Disease Control is basically said that, except they say 25% instead of 33% as far as girls.
Yeah.
And one study found that 85% of women in Australian prisons were victims of incest and other forms of abuse as minors.
Yep.
And then Macquarie University in Sydney looked at homeless children, and their study revealed that 82% had been sexually abused and 67 had been abused before the age of 11. So in Australia, you're dealing with the same type of systemic endemic that we're dealing with in the United States. Pretty much the numbers are similar.
Yeah. So, I mean, child sexual abuse is common. It's, most common in homes and families. It occurs in institutions, and obviously online space is just a burgeoning and really frightening space. But we also need to acknowledge that child sexual abuse doesn't occur in isolation. It by definition, I believe, people experiencing sexual abuse must experience emotional abuse or coercive control, all sorts of other violations. And what we know is that, when people are abused often repeatedly by the very people meant to care and nurture them, protect them, during the time when the brain is growing and developing, is that it has fundamental impacts as makes sense, on just your very core sense of self, the formation of that sense of self, on your identity, on your self-worth, on your ability to engage not only with yourself but with others and with the world, on physical and mental health. And there are stats everywhere about where survivors end up or go for support or engage with the criminal justice system or are homeless. And there are all sorts of reasons for this, and that's another part of the understanding, is understanding what is disrupted by repeated trauma, by complex trauma, and the ways people try and cope, because people try and cope as best they can, but many of those initial coping strategies actually become risk factors, not only for poor health, but for some of life's more difficult challenges.
I've previously said that if you could take one thing out of our society, that just one thing, if you could take child sexual abuse out of our society, the prisons would be empty or mostly empty. The psychiatric hospitals would be mostly empty. It would be a remarkably different society. But unfortunately, our society has yet to address this problem.
We're currently doing some work inside prisons through our helpline service. So this is phone sessions provided to inmates. And what we're certainly hearing, and this is anecdotal, is 95% plus of the people we're speaking to have experienced trauma, often from a very young age, and often, consistently over time, both to bring them into the system, but then within the system itself. And what we're hearing is that for the first time, people we're talking to actually feel that they're being treated like a human being, that they're actually starting to understand that what happened to them when they were young and vulnerable was not their fault. They're not inherently evil, but that their trauma, helps to explain, doesn't excuse it, but their behaviours and the reasons they're incarcerated. And, we're just trying to do an evaluation of this service because anecdotally we hear that, people, are starting to join the dots make sense of it, believe that they, hopefully can do things differently. As I say, it's anecdotal, but that's profound. And so we need to sort of, understand, what's happened to people along the life's journey to have affected them so profoundly, and what can we do? And often what we do is respond in a punitive way. And as I'm not arguing against being accountable for crimes, but, what is it that human beings need? And what is it that a lot of people in prison have lacked? It's a sense of safety. It's a sense of having someone who's there for you. It's an ability to trust. It's being understood and seen. So.
On your website, you discuss different types of trauma, and I'd like to get into that. You just have a general childhood trauma. Would you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, trauma is an event or multiple events which, overwhelm one's capacity to cope. And, childhood trauma, we're talking about experiences of, violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, but also experiences of when a caregiver or whoever is in the position of looking after the child is unable to attune to that child. And so the child is not receiving what one needs to help support a nervous system that can be calm, can learn how to regulate itself so that the child is able to go out and explore the world and come back to a sense of safety. And so childhood trauma, people tend to see it as a single event, but it's often, repeated and extreme and ongoing over time. And it often occurs in a context which is one of oppression or one of compounded disadvantage, so there's a lot of compounding factors as well. And so we need to understand childhood trauma in terms of the developmental impacts, the attachment impacts, the neurobiological impacts, the physiological responses.
And you also have a category for complex trauma. Could you discuss that with me?
Yeah, so complex trauma is repeated, ongoing, often extreme trauma, just such as we've described, which occurs in childhood, but can also occur as a young adult, as a young person or an adult over time. And what we know is that complex trauma tends to be cumulative, and many people who've experienced trauma as a child, it's almost as if they have a target on their head saying, hit me again, traumatize me again. Or they make choices not for any fault of theirs, which, are familiar, but arguably not in their best interest. For example, having multiple, serial domestic violence relationships. And so it's that compounding cumulative impact that we're talking about.
And then you have intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. So we know that, trauma can be passed down both, what we call epigenetically, so it can affect the genes for up to 4 generations. But we also know that the context in which trauma occurs can be replicated across generations as well. And, certainly within our First Nations community, and not to single out First Nations people, but the impacts of colonisation, oppression, exclusion, marginalisation have compounded that trauma both individually and collectively across generations.
You said that epigenetics is involved in that. Could you clarify that for us a little bit?
Yeah, so epigenetics is the way that genes express themselves. And what they've discovered is that the imprinting of trauma in genes, across generations is carried down. So, for example, my mother's a Holocaust survivor, so she didn't communicate anything to me about the Holocaust till I was, in my late teens. But still, there was a an impact both in the way she engaged with me, but also genetically in my body, in my DNA.
A friend of mine, his parents were in Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp, and they came here to the United States. They lived in Arizona, and they were very successful. But there was this pall of darkness over the household. And my friend, who's a very outgoing guy, and but he has tremendous problems with depression and anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, it's both what's said and what's not said, but then there's also the inherent transmission as well. Yeah.
And also organized abuse. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's akin to what I experienced. So this is abuse which is perpetrated by often multiple perpetrators, often working in networks, often sharing victims, can involve online spaces as well. So, child sexual abuse material can involve ritualized abuse and can be within the family as well as outside. So my experience was, with multiple perpetrators within the family, as well as systems of religious abuse as well.
I've dedicated 4 episodes. I've talked about 4 trafficking networks. One was the Epstein network, where there were many, many perpetrators, and only 2 of them were indicted, Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah.
The Franklin network, I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal. That was a huge network, and none of those perpetrators were indicted. The Finders network, which was in Baltimore, but I think it was more or less up and down the East Coast of America. None of those perps were indicted. The Finders had a network. None of those perps were indicted. And then a couple of weeks ago, I talked to the producer of a film called The Clown and the Candyman, and she was able to trace 2 serial killers, or had 2 serial killers had a tenuous relationship with a very large pedophile network. And it was the epicenter of that network was in Dallas. And when Dallas police executed a search warrant on this individual's home, he had 30,000 index cards of perpetrators and victims. And he was the only one that went to prison. And what's amazing is the State Department impounded those 30,000 index cards, and they were ultimately destroyed.
Wow.
So in my in the podcast thus far, I've really shown that these larger networks, no one really pays a price. It's really, and I'm sure, I know that Australia had an amazing royal commission that looked at these types of problems.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's such a disbelief in society. I think this is it's almost a developmental issue for society. There's a collective dissociation where society just does not want to know, and it's a step too far. When I first started working in this area, I used to quip that, talking about child sexual abuse was the best way to clear a room. Now, I think we're slightly better than that now, and certainly the Royal Commission, which ran from 2013 to 17, had a big part to play in that, because what it did was honour the stories, not just, I hate the word stories, honour the experiences of, many, many survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. And it also honoured the experiences of survivors who didn't survive. And it showed the importance of listening, hearing, believing, validating the way people are feeling. But what was interesting during that time, because I did, a bit of media related to the Royal Commission, was that the media over time became a bit inured. They always wanted a new angle or something, something to engage people. And I mean, that's a terrible indictment. And certainly what we've found, particularly related, there was a recommendation of the Royal Commission, which is a national redress scheme, a scheme that survivors can apply to for a payment and psychological counselling as well as an apology. But what we know is that applicants applying to that scheme who talk about pedophile rings and organised abuse and the realities that we know are not necessarily ones that receive, the response that they should, because there's still that level of disbelief. It's almost like as a species, we don't want to know. It's too discomforting. But it's way more discomforting for people who've experienced it. So how as a society does that change? What we've seen in this country is there's been a lot of shift in the family and domestic violence space. It's become an area that there's a very public conversation about it, and there's a lot of investment. And absolutely that needs to happen in the child sexual abuse case. The Royal Commission was fantastic. It was fantastic in the way it modelled honouring survivors and honouring their testimony. But the risk is losing some of that momentum. And we need to make sure that momentum, continues apace. That said, Blue Knot and two other organisations, the Australian Childhood Foundation and the Healing Foundation, are establishing a national centre for action on child sexual abuse. Now, that was another recommendation of the Royal Commission, and it's in its early stages. But, from that centre, and there's lots of other government initiatives and agencies and jurisdictions all doing good work, we hope to really interrogate the evidence of, what works, what doesn't work, where the gaps are, and what we need to do differently, because we absolutely need to do something differently. And we're very determined to keep child sexual abuse front and centre of the psyche of the Australian people, because, we really need to see transformative change in this area.
I think that edifying teachers in elementary schools and also middle schools and high schools about what to look for would be hugely helpful. If teachers had a cue of what to look for, I think that would be hugely helpful. And
also what to do.
Yes.
Then how to respond. Because often I think people are scared to ask, and we hear this from GPs and general practitioners, as I was, scared to ask, scared to open that proverbial can of worms, but also the fear to ask is something internal as well. It's fear to face your own stuff often too.
One thing that's counterintuitive that people don't understand is that although a child may be experiencing horrific abuse at home, that's the devil that they know. They're frightened of the devil that they don't know. And it's very difficult. You can take the child out of that type of environment, but the child wants to return to that environment. And it seems so counterintuitive, but in the framework of trauma, it's completely understandable.
My experience was absolutely that. And even though my mind buried the experience, that was my family. I came to, whenever anyone asked me about my childhood, I've been told, that I used to respond, very aggressively, and say I had a happy childhood. My mother told me so. but no detail, no nothing. There was nothing there. Yeah, that was it.
I had a happy childhood because my mother told me so too.
Yeah. Therefore, it must be. Yeah.
I'm sure that there's a number of people in society that can empathize with that.
Yeah, totally.
Tell us about Blue Note's trauma informed services. So I previously I introduced Lois Lee. She was way ahead of her time. In the 70s. She started Children of the Night for sex workers, and they provided a number where if someone was in trouble, if someone was a sex worker, they wanted out, they could call the number, and Children of the Night would pick them up, house them, get them counseling services, chemical dependency services, help them get a GED, and even get them into college if they wanted to go to college.
Wow. Wow.
And so with Blue Knot Foundation, what happens? Someone interacts and they've obviously been traumatized. How do you start to help that person?
Yeah, I mean, they engage with one of our helpline services. They speak with a trauma counsellor. What we are told is unique about our service is that our counsellors give them time and space to be heard, not to try and fix it, but really to try and meet the person where they are in the present, find out what it is they need right now, and then, help them if they're experiencing strong emotions or not feeling settled, to help them to self-soothe and calm their nervous system, try and give them a sense of safety, and then explore what it is they need. And often that's, they might call several times. They might go to one of our workshops for survivors where we provide people with some, basic education around trauma and what it means, because many people who've experienced trauma blame themselves, and society has also, historically blamed victims for their own victimhood. And what we find is that when people start to understand just some simple stuff about the brain, things fall into place and make sense, and can actually remove that sense of self-blame and start people on a journey to healing. We have, lots of information, many fact sheets, videos people can watch, listening to other people's stories of healing and recovery. For us, the very, very important part of the message is that, healing is absolutely possible. It's about holding hope, even when people don't feel there's any hope, about knowing that, everyone is an individual. They have their own experiences. They have their own ways of coping. It's about acknowledging that, and supporting them to find what it is they need, which will help them. And, people will engage at different times. People will come and go because they need different things at different times. We're not a one-stop shop, but we have, extensive networks of support that we can engage people with. And so what we do, other than direct support and all the resources we provide, is we provide a lot of professional development training for just about anyone from any sector, because we know that survivors engage everywhere, and are readily triggered by responses which may appear innocuous to the person, but for a survivor who's come from a space of being ignored or being coerced, or not having a choice or being disempowered, that will trigger, throw them back into a past experience, and they may appear to react. They will react. So it's about that person understanding why it happened and how to engage in a way that makes it less likely to happen, and to be there to hear what that person needs in the moment. So we do a lot of training. We provide supervision to practitioners and other workers, and we work with organisations so that they can become more trauma-informed. And that's a word that, is bandied around a lot, but what it means is, basically more human. Put the person back into systems, because we find a lot of systems exist for the sake of systems, rather than for the people that they're there to support and serve.
So Blue Note has a network of services, as in psychotherapeutic help, different types of counseling, and do you help the person? A lot of people, when the DID erupts, I mean, they go to pieces but a lot of them don't have any resources, and as I showed, a lot of them end up homeless. And how do you help those?
Yeah. So I mean, again, by being there and engaging with whoever and whatever presents on the phone, whichever part of a person presents, but also in matching people up or providing a number of referrals to people that we've assessed as having the skills, hopefully having the skills. Obviously, there's no, one can't be inside a therapeutic space to understand what goes on. But we try and work only with services and agencies that we believe can engage with people with this sort of trauma. And obviously people who've experienced DID and dissociation, need people with, particular skills and relational skills. But what we've also done is develop sets of practice guidelines, which, normally aren't very exciting, but these guidelines, we believe, have certainly led the way for practice and standards for practitioners and agencies, at least in this country, around responding in a trauma-informed way, complex trauma way, and also around working with dissociation. So we feel that, a lot of what we've developed, whereas we may not directly help as many survivors as we'd love to help, that we can influence the support that many more receive from the way where they're engaging, because of the other work that we do, because of the resources we provide. And those resources are built on, the evidence of lived and living experience, practice evidence, as well as the latest research. So we combine all of those, collate and distill it into a way that we believe is accessible, translatable, and that people can pick up and use and have the tools to influence their practice. Because what we know is that, in most universities and colleges in this country, working with complex trauma is not at the top of the list. Often is an accessory after the fact, gets, an hour, in a 4-year course. And we know that, when practitioners don't have the skills to engage in a way where they understand that, some people who've experienced this trauma have never felt safe, that it's going to take a long time for them to come to trust you. They sound simple and basic, but if that's not understood, patients are labelled as being resistant or oppositional or difficult, rather than people who've experienced, deep and ongoing trauma, and that they're presenting in a way that makes total sense in the context of that.
So Blue Knot facilitates the people getting help through organizations or institutions that you've vetted and are that work with you.
Yeah, and practitioners,
practitioners. And how many people go through your program a year, do you think?
Yeah, so, on our helplines, there'd be, between 40 and 50,000 people that we train, a similar number. People we influence through our publications, a greater number still. People who we influence through social media and media, in the millions. So it's a significant number. It's hard to measure, in quantums like that. But it's it's the ever increasing circles of influence, and we feel that our advocacy role and our thought leadership role has had a profound influence. We were the organisation that, in the early stages of the Royal Commission, explained what trauma-informed approaches were, and worked with the Royal Commission to help establish its processes, including its physical presence, to make it a more welcoming, calming, safer space for survivors coming forward.
And I see that you have programs for the friends and families and supporters of survivors too.
Yeah, I mean, friends and family can feel, incredibly confused about what's going on. I know in my own situation, my husband was terrified when I started experiencing flashbacks. Neither of us knew what was happening. And it's, there's also a lot of shame for family members. So where do they go to for support? Where do they go to for information? And what's very important is for family members to understand, what this journey looks like, understand what's happening to the person that they care about, so they can make sense of it, but also to understand that they need to look after themselves as well, to, ensure that they're getting their own support, because they can feel as isolated as survivors do on their journey. And what we know is that many survivors can feel incredibly alienated, as if no one understands and as if, this hasn't happened to anyone before. So just as in survival workshops, people can feel a camaraderie of commonality, not to say that, people's stories aren't unique and individual, but there are some very common themes. And the same for the workshops we run for, for family members as well. But, it's you're there in the community and you're hearing that you're not an alien, people are having very similar experiences. And that can really make a difference. And again, where can family members go to for help and support? And they can also ring our helplines, and many fact sheets on our website that translated in different languages, available in plain English and easy read for people with disabilities. So we're trying to meet the needs of different communities and to reach them in different ways.
In Australia, you have a huge Aboriginal population. And do you see, what are those statistics like compared to the non-Aboriginal population?
Look, probably, 5 to 6 times plus the prevalence of child sexual abuse. We're working in this National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, I was talking about, in partnership with the Healing Foundation, which is a preeminent First Nations organisation in the country. And, I'm learning a lot, to be honest, about, I always understood the collective experience that Aboriginal people have had, but the complete dislocation from land and place and kin is just so profound. It's profound for all of us, but for First Nations people, that's just fundamental.
So ultimately, you think that it's the oppression that have made those numbers so high? I
think there's many elements to it. There's many elements to it. I mean, it's a loss of identity. I mean, colonisation sort of annihilated sense of identity and sense of connection, and trying to sort of reground and reconnect to the spaces that feed you for all of us is what's critical.
Are there First Nation people that come through the Blue Knot Foundation that you see?
There are a small percentage, but there are, and again, it's about connecting where people are, but in the context of where they've come from their culture, their background. You don't need to be an expert in their experience, but it's about empathy, compassion, meeting them.
And I see that Blue Knot also provides services or workshops for professionals and service personnel. And what I have seen, I've been at this about 21 years, and what I've seen is there's a lot of professionals that really don't know how, they can't even begin to diagnose DID. Their minds are in different paradigms concerning drugs and
Yeah.
and I've seen people that were DID go through a lot of different types of professionals before they were finally able to get help from someone who had expertise in that field, knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So how do you help these professionals to understand this population?
Yeah. So look, we have a number of different training programs which are grounded in the evidence that I spoke about before, which sort of scaffold a learning program for them to help to give them the building blocks and the tools, firstly to understand what it is that people have experienced and how it may affect them, but also, ways in which they can work with them in a safe way, and to identify, to move away from, just a solely biomedical lens, which is diagnostic and labeling. And we know that, many people who've experienced complex trauma carry multiple comorbid diagnoses, which obviously aren't doing the trick. And that if you ask, a number of professionals, they'll all diagnose something different. But there's obviously a lot of, divisions within practitioner circles and disciplines and, some political motivations, dare I say, around perceptions of dissociation and DID. And there's a long way to go, despite the fact that the evidence and research is very comprehensive and rich. But it's, I call it drip irrigation, step at a time to invoke the change. But what we know is that, the lack of understanding, really does cause harm, because people who've experienced this sort of trauma really find it hard to reach out for help and to trust. And so if and when they have an experience with a practitioner who may have the best of intentions, but which is, negative and re-traumatizing, it's going to take them a long time to reach out again. And so, what we're seeking to do is build the capacity of the workforce to respond in a way which is informed, and to identify when, they may be out of their depth, and how to warm refer someone to someone who has the skills and the expertise.
With these workshops that you offer, do you find that there is a chasm between the practitioner's paradigm that they're operating from and then being able to diagnose complex trauma and DID? Is that something that that the chasm is fairly wide in a lot of practitioners? Or
look, it's it's a work in progress. I think there's been an enormous amount of new research in the trauma field in the last 20 years, and it's certainly seeping through, but it's seeping through to groups of practitioners, and certainly people who work in different ways. And there are pockets of where it's not so well understood at all. So it's absolutely a work in progress. For some people, yes, a chasm. For others, a very keen desire to learn, and for many, a lot of aha moments when they're connecting, what we're saying from the neuroscience with what they've observed and experienced, but haven't had the language for, or understood the evidence base around. So I do think it's changing, but I think it's very slow, and there's a long way to go.
And what is Blue Knot on your website, a vision for a trauma-informed world? Could you tell us about this ideal that you have?
Yeah, well, it's an ideal that we'd lovely. It's a trauma-informed world. Is a world in which, it's a bit Pollyanna, world in which human beings honour and respect one another genuinely, in which judgment is put aside, in which, we are genuinely empathic, not patronising, in which we understand that we can all be vulnerable, and that vulnerability can actually be a strength, and that we need, to engage with it and, work together to look at possibilities for genuine connection and engagement, tolerance, acceptance. So I said it was Pollyanna, but wouldn't that be wonderful?
Well, it's always good to have ideals that you're
Yeah.
striving.
Yeah.
That's how very good things can become actualized.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Cathy, I really want to thank you for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast.
I really want to thank you, Nick, for the opportunity and for what you're doing. It's amazing.
So, well, thank you. And one of these days I might make it to Australia. I've got this phobia of great white sharks, though. I don't know. I mean, the beaches look wonderful, but I've heard that great whites hang out in around Australia. I mean, I'm worried about great white sharks when I'm swimming in a lake in the Midwest.
Look, you just got to get to know them like anyone else.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind. And
yeah.
Cathy, have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Nick.
Bye.